Scottish election is just a matter of days away, and people around the country face a massive decision to decide who to vote for in the upcoming Holyrood election. We caught up with Chris McCall, the Daily Record's deputy political editor, to get the lowdown on each of the main Scottish political parties, starting with the SNP and John Swinney.
The first thing to say about the SNP is that throughout this election campaign, and indeed for the last year, they have been miles in front of their opponents in the polls. John Curtis, who's obviously the country's leading pollster, he told my colleague Paul Hutchin last week there's basically a 1 in 100 chance that John Swinney will not be the First Minister after the election on Thursday. So it's important to caveat that about the SNP, because basically they are going to be returned to power, which means that what they're promising voters in their manifesto here, they're actually going to be expected to deliver upon. This isn't just a fantasy document. The SNP is almost certainly going to be in power. They're almost certainly going to have to try and get some of this manifesto actually, delivered. I guess there's two kind of big themes to what the SNP have been talking about in this campaign. I'll talk a bit briefly about those and we can kind of go into more detail. One, which will surprise nobody that has any knowledge of the SNP or Scottish politics, and that, of course, is independence.
Friends, I know that times are tough out there. Food prices have shot up, household bills are soaring, and filling the tank now empties your pocket. In energy-rich Scotland, people can't afford to heat their homes. In a country with more renewable power than we use, our bills are soaring. And in a country where oil and gas has sent £350 billion to Westminster, a Labour government tried to rob our pensioners of their heating allowance. Friends, the problem is not that we don't have the energy. The problem is that Westminster has the power. This election is our opportunity to take those powers and put them into Scotland's hands. Lower bills, more jobs, a greener future. That's what you get when you vote SNP.
John Swinney has been very keen to talk about independence at every single campaign event he's done. His message is quite simple. He says to voters, if you vote for my party, this is the first real step to achieving Scotland of becoming an independent country. Now, we can kind of go into the detail about that and say, is that actually a realistic or feasible prospect? But regardless, that's something that John Swinney and the SNP have been very keen to talk about, because obviously they have been in power for a very long time. They have been in power at Holyrood since 2007. There are voters going to the polls on Thursday who can't remember a time when the SNP have not been in power at Holyrood. And John Swinney himself, he's been part of that SNP government since day one. He is by some distance now. We've got a lot of experienced MSPs who've chosen to leave ahead of this election. John Swinney is by a long way the most experienced minister in the Scottish Parliament. And again, that's been something else the SNP's been very, very keen to talk about in this campaign, is to emphasise John Swinney as being the man of experience. He knows what he's doing and you can trust him. Separately to independence, though, the other issue the SNP has been very, very keen to talk about is the cost of living and what can be done to kind of help with that. I mean, again, here's just a flavour of what they're talking about in their manifesto. I mean, they're not being subtle about this. But the one thing you could say is, obviously, the Scottish Government has limited powers when it comes to things like the economy. So how can they make direct interventions to help people that are struggling? Well, the SNP would say that they can do that with things like benefits. They have some power over welfare. They have already introduced what's called the Scottish Child Payment. Sorry, that's a standalone payment that's only made in Scotland to certain families. And the big ticket item on the cost of living, which kind of took some observers by surprise, including myself, I'll be honest. When John Swinney launched the manifesto document in Glasgow a couple of weeks ago, he talked about his ambition to introduce price caps on certain food items. And at the time, on this announcement, people were kind of like, do you have the power to do that? And John Swinney's argument is that the Scottish Government has powers over public health emergencies, how to respond to improve public health generally. And he could use those to work with supermarkets, because it's supermarkets that he's targeting this at. To what he kind of describes as you would get a basket of basic essentials, things like bread, milk, so forth, and they would be set at basically a price dictated by the government. Now, there's been a lot of pushback to this from opposition parties, retailers, just kind of people that have been around a long time who've seen this policy being implemented in other places. And there's a lot of scepticism, it's fair to say, about firstly whether the government actually has the legal powers to do this, and secondly whether or not it could actually have some negative unintended consequences. We've in the records we've talked to a few think tanks, people like the IFS, and they've suggested that if you basically dictate to supermarkets what they can sell and what prices they sell, the supermarkets will go out their way not to. They'll have a very small number of those things, and they'll offset the cost of selling them at reduced prices on other items, and this could have all sorts of unintended consequences. But John Swinney's been adamant throughout this campaign that he thinks it's a good thing, and he's going to be bringing forward plans to do this. Whether or not that happens remains to be seen.
Absolutely. So what is the perception of John Swinney in Scotland then? Among the, obviously we've got the SNP voters, but then what is the general perception of what people think of John Swinney as First Minister? Is he a popular man? Is he someone who is going to sway the neutrals, I guess?
Well, I think firstly we have to say John Swinney is following Nicola Sturgeon is retired from the Scottish Parliament now. So of the new cohort of MSPs that will be returned on Thursday, John Swinney is by some distance the best known. In terms of his popularity, all the leaders of the Scottish parties in recent polls, going back quite a while, all of them kind of dip into the negative in terms of popularity. But, and it's an important but, John Swinney's numbers are still better than any of his opponents. John Swinney's got the advantage against someone like Anas Sarwar of Scottish Labour or Russell Finlay of the Scottish Conservatives. Number one, the public know who Swinney is. I mean, they generally know who Anas Sarwar is, of course, and to a lesser extent Russell Finlay. But most of the public has a firm idea of who John Swinney is and what he's about. And that, again, I mentioned his experience. He's been around a long time in government. He was also been around even longer in sort of party politics. I mean, remember, this isn't even John Swinney's first spell as SNP leader. He was leader back in the early 2000s, at a time when the SNP was at far lower an ebb than they are now. They were an opposition party in the Scottish Parliament. They had far fewer MSPs, they had far fewer MPs. And there were some in Scotland at that time who never thought the SNP could actually take power, but they did, and they've been a fixture at Holyrood ever since. And John Swinney's been a big part of that. I think though, it's an old cliche, but familiarity breeds contempt. So on the one hand, where it's a positive that John Swinney is very well known, been around a long time, a lot of voters that maybe previously used to vote SNP but don't anymore, or they've voted for the Labour or the Greens or the Conservatives or the Lib Dems, they look at Swinney and they say with some justification, isn't it time that somebody else had a shot? Isn't it time that there was a new party could come in and offer some fresh ideas? And that is a very potent criticism. And the SNP's tried to kind of counter that in this election campaign, because change is like the big word that all parties want to use an election. Keir Starmer talked about it in 2024. You know, we think back to Obama in 2008. You know, it's a very, you know, message that drives people. We want change. We want things to get better. But it's kind of difficult for the SNP to kind of argue that when they have been in power in Scotland for 20 years. Of course, the SNP say, well, vote for us for independence. What could be bigger? What could be a bigger change than creating, you know, a new country or a new political apparatus separate from Westminster? But again, it comes back to, do voters really believe that independence is coming in the short to medium term? Some polling suggests the answer is no. You know, while they might not like Keir Starmer or Labour in Westminster, they also recognise that there are a lot of big issues going on right now that maybe take priority over another constitutional row. But yeah, that's kind of where we're at just now.
So what will be the key deciding factor, in your opinion, Chris, to whether the neutral voter will be turning out for SNP on voting day?
I think the SNP, like all other parties right now, are struggling with what I can't claim credit for this term, but this election campaign, this election has been dubbed the meh election, because that's kind of been the response from voters who've been talking to pollsters, taking part in focus groups, have kind of been shrugging their shoulders, going, we don't particularly like any of them. And, you know, for very familiar reasons to anybody, you know, that's been in a supermarket today, yesterday, you know, you're looking at the prices of things and wincing. You know, inflation has been stubbornly high. The cost of living has been an issue now, you know, 5-6 years since COVID, and since the energy market kind of went through the roof in the back of the invasion of Ukraine, and all these other big issues. You know, voters, you know, a word that we've kept hearing again and again and again, the old Scots word scunnered. Politicians have been repeating that endlessly. Voters are scunnered, and, you know, they're scunnered with the cost of living. They're scunnered with low wages. They're scunnered with the condition of their local high street. And while, you know, not all of these things can be laid at the door of the SNP's long time in power at Holyrood, it does create this sort of feeling of, well, what's the point? Is anything really going to change regardless of how I vote? And I think, you know, that's the main thing the SNP will be worried about. They know, they've looked at the polls, they know that if the polls are replicating on Thursday, they're home and dry, it'll be the biggest party, John Swinney will be the First Minister again. But, you know, I think they are worried about how much of their core support, you know, people that have voted with the SNP consistently for 10, 20 years, whether these people are still going to be motivated enough to actually make it to the polling station on Thursday. Because if they aren't, if there's a low turnout, particularly in some constituencies in the sort of central belt in Scotland, we might see, you know, 2-3 horse races emerge where perhaps the SNP are up against Labour, perhaps they're up against Reform. Reform, of course, are the great unknown in this election, as you know, they're effectively a brand new party. And I think that will be worrying John Swinney. He'll be hoping, you know, I hope my vote turns out. You know, he's going to win, but what's the scale of the victory? Is it going to be a majority where the SNP can govern without having to, you know, rely on anyone else? Or is he going to be short of that, and then he has to deal with other parties, and, you know, there's a bit of horse trading involved. So yeah, it's the SNP's election to lose. It really is. You know, they're kind of, they've got a foot in the door. They just really need to, you know, hold it open and get through, and, you know, get John Swinney back, you know, his feet under the desk and back in power. But we'll find out soon enough whether that's going to be enough.
Let's talk about Reform then. You mentioned there about them being the sort of great unknown, I guess, coming into this election. So what have they been talking about in the run up to this? What have been the main talking points coming out of Reform in Scotland in the last few weeks?
Well, obviously with Reform, I mean, the one issue that every voter sort of understands that is a core priority for Reform is immigration. And the Reform argument that immigration to the UK is out of control Now, that becomes a little bit more difficult in the context of a Scottish election because immigration is an issue that's wholly reserved to Westminster. The Scottish government under the SNP is very, very pro-immigration. They make the basic argument that Scotland has an ageing population. We need people to move here to come and work in the NHS, work in our care sector, and public services would be in a very difficult position without people moving to Scotland. But Reform argue against that. And although, they are going to return MSPs, there's going to be a big block of MSPs in Holyrood after Thursday. And I would expect them to continue arguing quite vociferously, we need to have fewer immigrants coming here. They won't have the power at Holyrood to do anything about that. But another issue that kind of ties in to Reform's big talking point is housing and also, to a lesser extent, welfare, because Reform argue that a consequence of high immigration levels in the UK and to a lesser extent in Scotland is that there's enormous pressure on housing. And the example Reform have talked a lot about in this Holyrood election campaign is Glasgow, where I'm talking from right now. We've done a lot of reporting on the Daily Record about the pressure the housing system is under in Glasgow. And it's important to say there's a lot of factors at work here. I don't think it's fair to blame it on immigration solely, but also we have to acknowledge that Glasgow, more than any other Scottish city, and certainly compared to other big UK cities, Glasgow does receive an above average number of migrants coming here to work, also receives an above average number of people coming here to declare asylum. Now, Reform, they argue, they push this very strongly. They argue that's basically because they think, migrants coming to Glasgow, asylum seekers coming to Glasgow, they kind of view Glasgow as a bit of a soft touch, is how Reform would put it. Now, Glasgow City Council, which is led by an SNP administration, they would argue against that. They would say that Glasgow has a long record of being a city that welcomes migrants, welcomes asylum seekers. This goes right back to the kind of late 1990s. But Reform would argue, well, that's one thing, but the numbers involved now are far higher and public services just can't cope. There's massive pressures on social housing. Rough sleeping in Glasgow, unfortunately, the numbers are up. That's one of my colleagues, Mark McGovern. He's written quite a lot about that in the Daily Record. The issue, the condition of Glasgow city centre, whether that's basic things like potholes on roads, pavements, it's a big talking point in the city. And Reform kind of has viewed this as a wedge issue. They can say, look at Glasgow, this is what happens if you don't get a grip on the immigration system. But as I say, the SNP and the Scottish Greens, they argue they push back against this in a big way and say it's just not true to blame immigration for all the issues facing Glasgow. Of course, whether this will make a difference, because Reform are the kind of unknown factor, we won't know until Thursday. Now, I was at a Reform campaign event last week. Malcolm Offord was speaking in Castlemilk, which is a very large housing estate in the south edge of the city. And Reform argue that these are the kind of places that have been forgotten, previously under Labour governments in Scotland and currently under the SNP. Malcolm Offord, who is obviously the leader of Reform in Scotland, he says these places have been forgotten about. They've lost things like their local police station. They've lost things like a reliable bus service. The condition of the public realm, like I talked about, potholes on the roads, has only declined. And as a result, he says people should come and Reform. We're something different. Give us a go. Now, we look at the polling. As I say, the SNP miles out in front. But quite a few polls recently have put Reform in second. Now, not by very far. So it's I would say at the moment, it looks like a dead heat between Reform or Scottish Labour in terms of who finishes second. I wouldn't want to come off the fence right now and predict one or the other. Usually when I do that, I'm completely wrong. But there is a chance, there's a very real chance, I think, that Reform could finish second, and that would be a huge moment for them, for Reform, the party. It would be a huge moment for Malcolm Offord, who was kind of very little known outside the political circles until a few months ago. I mean, he was a Tory minister, but he wasn't a very well-known Tory minister. But that would really signal Reform's arrival in Scotland. Their predecessor party, UKIP, they were never really at the races in Scotland. I mean, Nigel Farage has obviously been a very well-known figure, but he's never really attracted much in the way of support from the Scottish electorate before. That is obviously going to change this week. We just don't know to what extent. If Reform finished third, I think they would be a bit disappointed. I think they would kind of look at that and think we could have done better here. But they are going to be this new voice at Holyrood. I mean, that's something we can say with real certainty. And what they use that voice for, well, we'll wait and see. But as I say, immigration is going to be one thing, pressure on public services will be another. And the third thing I should talk about, because this is very much kind of the Malcolm Offord's big personal thing, is income tax. So income tax bans for ordinary workers, they're set by the Scottish Parliament. It's a relatively new power. It's only been the sort of last 5-6 years, or maybe slightly longer than that. I'm sure someone in the comments can tell me. But it's in the power of Holyrood. And what the SNP have done is they have increased income tax rates, the income tax bans on the highest earners. Now, this is where it becomes a big political point, because the SNP would say more workers in Scotland pay less income tax than if they were living elsewhere in the UK. So they say the lowest paid are actually paying less income tax. But I think the level at which that changes is about £33,000 a year. So you've got this huge swathe of public sector workers, people like teachers, people like senior nurses, certainly doctors, qualified medics, people like police officers, who are paying more income tax in Scotland than they would if they lived in England, if they lived in Wales. And it's not only Reform that have pointed this out, it's a big issue for the Scottish Conservatives. It's something Scottish Labour also talk about. But Reform have really pushed this, because Reform and Malcolm Offord in particular, their big ticket item, their big manifesto commitment is if we took power at Holyrood, we would cut income tax. And they're looking at quite big sweeping changes to that as well. And needless to say, not needless to say, but it should be said that the highest earners would stand to benefit most from these Reform tax cuts. So that is a big, compared to the other parties, compared to the Scottish Labour position, compared to the SNP position, this kind of does set Reform out. Reform are saying we'll come in and cut income tax. Now, there is obviously a big unanswered question of, well, how do you afford that? Public services are under massive pressure. The Scottish budget is already stretched to a huge degree. So Malcolm Offord has been facing a lot of questions. Well, how are you going to pay for this? How are you going to balance the books and make these tax cuts? And I think Reform have been pretty vague on this, but what they would answer is that, there's a huge public sector in Scotland. There's all these quangos, we'll get rid of some of them, we're going to cut spending on others, but they haven't really gone into specifics on this. And I think that's something that they will, eventually are going to have to give more detail on.
So, name and title for Levels, please.
Alex Cole-Hamilton, leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats.
Tell me how the Liberal Democrat campaign is going for Holyrood, please.
We are having the time of our lives. Obviously, we're just coming into this election off the back of our best general election result in 100 years. 72 MPs across the UK, trebled our seats in Scotland, overtook the Tories and came within touching distance of the Scottish National Party. We hope to replicate that in May, whether that's in the 10 target constituencies where we're on the verge of winning against the SNP. But for the first time in a long time, that second peach-coloured regional ballot is going to be absolutely key for the Lib Dems. We stand to pick up in almost every region, and wherever you are, you can enjoy the service of a Lib Dem MSP who will fight for you and your community.
And what will Lib Dems be focusing on in the next Parliament come May when you hopefully have a much larger batch of MSPs behind you?
Well, in the next Parliament, we'll be focusing on the instructions that we are given by the people of this country. And we know what those will be because we knock more doors than anybody else. And those are 4 key areas. That's addressing the crisis in our health service, whether that's access to local healthcare or dealing with the bottleneck in our hospitals by fixing social care. We want to get Scottish education back to its best by taking mobile phones out of classrooms and putting pupil support assistance in. We want to drive down the cost of living by insulating cold Scottish homes and powering them with renewable energy, and we want to get Scotland moving again, dualling key northern roads like the A9, the A96, whilst fixing the ferries fiasco for good.
So let's talk about the Liberal Democrats then. So they're going to be outsiders, certainly going into this election. But what are the big talking points that they're coming out with at the moment?
Okay, so I've got a Lib Dem leaflet here. Just show you that they're claiming in Glasgow. It's Lib Dems of the SNP. Now, I would charitably argue that is not the case. I would argue that's not the case in any constituency in Glasgow or even the regional list. But, the Lib Dems, not just in Scotland, but across the UK, the one thing they're very, very skilled at is they know where their vote is concentrated, and they know really the areas that they think they can do well. And the kind of things that the Lib Dems have been saying, they've kind of talking about. So they are, they're a very centrist party, the Lib Dems. It's kind of steady as she goes, but the sort of big ticket items I think they would say is we want to improve things like transport. We want to make sure ScotRail's affordable. We want to make sure buses run on time. We want the NHS to work because there's like elsewhere in the UK, the NHS in Scotland's under massive pressure. Non-emergency procedures, there are tens of thousands of people waiting a very long time to be seen. There's great unhappiness about that. The Lib Dems are saying, look, we need to do things better. But the Lib Dem campaign, kind of unusually, well, compared to obviously like Labour Reform, the SNP, who they really are campaigning Scotland-wide, the Lib Dems, there are very key areas that they think they can do well. And so, not in the city itself, but kind of in the Glasgow suburbs, out in East Dunbartonshire, that's absolutely prime Lib Dem territory. They would be hopeful that they can win the constituency there. The further north, up in the Highlands, Kate Forbes, who is still the Deputy First Minister, but by the end of this week won't be, she's standing down from Parliament. The Lib Dems think they can win her seat. And, I mean, it's not going to deprive the SNP of victory, I would wager, but that would be a big blow, I think, to the SNP in the Highlands. If they can't hold on to a seat represented by someone as big a name as Kate Forbes. The Lib Dems are also quite strong in places like Orkney, places like Shetland, places like Caithness, and also in Edinburgh. They aren't just a rural party by any means. Alec Cole-Hamilton, who is the Scottish Lib Dems member, his constituencies in Edinburgh, he will be very confident that he can hold that. And it just shows you, so the Lib Dems, they are very canny. They are the voice of rural communities, of certain rural communities, but also kind of more affluent suburban seats, like in East Dunbartonshire. The Lib Dem message resonates. And I think they would also be hopeful that they can benefit from tactical voting. The Lib Dems love a tactical vote. And in certain constituencies, maybe in the Central Belt, they'll be hoping that people that are maybe fed up with the SNP will lean into the Lib Dems. Perhaps in the further north of Scotland, maybe anti-reform voting, maybe people who have voted Conservative in the past but aren't convinced by reform, maybe they'll go Lib Dem to ensure reform don't win. These are the kind of tactics at play, which kind of makes the final result on Thursday a bit more difficult to call at this position. So the Lib Dems last time around, back in 2021, they didn't have a particularly great election. They only returned single figures MSPs. They want to get back into double figures. And And I think they will do that. I think that's absolutely achievable for them. To what extent they can, do they get closer to 10 or closer to 20 will largely be dictated by how Labour and Reform do. If that soft Labour vote kind of melts away, maybe the Lib Dems will benefit. But in more rural seats, if Reform kind of get a hold there, maybe Lib Dems will suffer. But it's been, I feel maybe the Lib Dems would have looked at this election campaign and thought they were always going to have a battle to be heard, because so much of this campaign is obviously centred around John Swinney and the SNP and the talk of independence, Scottish Labour, and how they deal with the unpopularity of Keir Starmer, and then obviously Reform. They have been the big three parties that have sucked all the energy, what energy there has been in this campaign. That's all come from those three parties, and the Lib Dems will feel that maybe they've been squeezed a bit. But they would argue that they're fine with that, because all their energy and their campaigning is going into certain target seats that they're confident will pay off on the day.